Welcome back to Faith Unaltered and Hebrew Bible Breakdown. We're excited to come to you in the afternoon today on a Wednesday instead of our regular Wednesday night time. And so hopefully plenty of you guys are here and able to join us during the middle of the workday. If not, I'm sure you will enjoy catching it at a later time. But I am super excited because one of my favorite philosophers and theologians is able to be with us today and join us. And it's NathanAJacobs. He's an Eastern Orthodox philosopher, theologian, and also does lots of other random ventures and things, which we're going to get into today. Any of you who've watched Faith Unaltered in the past probably have caught his episode where he's come on here and talked about an Eastern Orthodox philosophy of time. So go back and catch that episode. So because of that, I don't feel like you need to do like the full intro to who you are and how you became Orthodox and your history of philosophy and ideas and all those good things. But I'm sure some of that we're going to get into today. But I'm more interested in like how you got into these other ventures that like we're going to talk about, like Hollywood, film, storytelling, art, and how that kind of broaches our topic of the Bible and how you see those intersecting.
Sure. Okay, so I'll skip over the whole like twisty turny how I became a philosopher and how LSD, threw me onto a spiritual journey and then led to philosophy and theology and all the rest. And I'll focus instead on the art side, which actually answers that. So you can see some of my artwork behind me. So I was a art student, right? I was an artist at the Maryland Institute College of Art. When I was early on in my existential crisis, that was what propelled me into the study of philosophy and religion. And so once I left art school in order to go study philosophy and religion, during my master's years, right, while I was working on my master's thesis, I actually went and I took a job just really randomly working in the video game industry. So I was like, I don't want to do a normal job, right? Like that would be crazy. So I started just shopping my portfolio around to video game companies. And I thought maybe I could find one. And one actually hired me. So I was doing concept art, storyboarding, cutscenes. They taught me CGI, all that sort of stuff. Most fun I ever had at work. The best job I ever had in that sense. It was a lot of fun. Also not terribly meaningful, but it was a lot of fun. But that's also what sort of laid the groundwork for how I started bumping into filmmakers as I started moving around. Because when you're in academia, you go where the degree is, you go where the job is. And so I moved around a lot. I've lived in a lot of different states. And along the way, there was this time where, because of certain strikes in Hollywood, a lot of states like Georgia, for example, had offered these tax incentives to try to lure business out of Hollywood. And that's how you ended up getting, places like, Georgia, where you have all the Marvel movies shot, for example, because they were trying to lure people away for tax incentives. Well, a lot of different states were doing that. And that was during the time that I was moving around. So I kept on bumping into filmmakers, which was a little weird for me. I was like, I thought all you guys are out in California. Like, why are you in Michigan? Why are you in Chicago? Like, what is going on? And it was through those encounters that I would always, because I was always fascinated with film. I loved film. But I just thought, like, that's not a real job. People don't really do that, right? Like, that would be ridiculous to do that sort of thing for a living. But nonetheless, when I met people who were excited about it or working in it or whatever, I was fascinated. So I'd start to talk to them. And what I was surprised by is that I discovered that film is kind of a meritocracy. They don't really care whether you went to film school. They care whether or not you can do the thing that they need you to do. And there's a lot of stories like that, right? Like people who were originally just making YouTube videos and then get hired. And like one of my favorite stories is this 15-year-old kid who did like the Lego scenes for one of the Spider-Verse movies, which they didn't even know he was a kid. They just saw the stuff he was doing, and Sony reached out and they're like, hey, can you do a cutscene? Whatever team did this. And it's like some kid who did it in his bedroom after school. But I found that out, right? I found that out firsthand that filmmakers didn't really care if you went to film school. They cared what you could do. And so a lot of filmmakers who I met along the way were really intrigued with what I was doing in terms of the fact that, well, you're a storyteller, or you're a writer, you're a scholar, philosophy and religion, but you also like do cutscenes and you storyboard things and you think like a director. And they're like, I'd really be interested in working with you on something. And so that happened enough times that I eventually just couldn't resist trying it. So I cobbled together, this professional crew and a little bit of funding to do a short film. And then that went well enough that people were like, well, we do a feature with you if you'd want. And so I cobbled together a feature, and I just on the side, like I shot it in the summer. I edited it, during the school year and into the summer. And that was a college comedy that I did called Killing Poe, if people want to search that. Not terribly deep and meaningful. I mean, it's college comedy. But anyway, that was the first sort of thing that I did. And then in terms of like a big project. And then it was because of that that the Antiochian Archdiocese actually approached me. So this was around the time that I'd gone through my philosophical journey. I was now I was teaching philosophy, and I was, I was a convert to Orthodoxy. And they reached out to me because they were like, "Look, we heard about you. You're like this Orthodox convert, but you're also a philosopher and a theologian, and you apparently made a movie, and we want to just talk to you about, how we could utilize what you're doing to engage culture." And so they pitched me some ideas. I told them their ideas were terrible and pitched something else. And then like I ended up doing this documentary, Becoming Truly Human, which was on the Religiously Unaffiliated, which I'm guessing, Courtney, you've definitely seen. That's the rumor.
Yes.
So that's how that documentary came about. I was basically like, look, I'm not a documentarian. Like I work in narrative, but if I were tasked with doing a project like this is how I would do it. And anyway, I could talk about that project if you want me to, but that's how that project came about. They financed it. I took time off for teaching, and then additional time to promote it. It did a limited theatrical and things like that. And then while I was doing that, some people, it caught the attention of certain investors who were like, "Hey, we're interested in what you're doing." Actually, what happened first was I went and I screened it for the Metropolitan, of the Antiochian Archdiocese. And I sat there with him, sweating, going, "Okay, this is what you paid for. I hope you like I hope you like it." And he was like, "I'm obsessed with what you've done here. I want you to leave teaching and I want you to start, making movies." And I was like, "Okay, you're going to pay me to do that, Your Eminence?" He's like, "No, but I will pray for you, And so I said, "Okay, well, I'll think about that then." But thankfully, I did end up bumping into some folks who were intrigued enough by what I was doing, and certain ideas that were in the works, that they were willing to back the development of projects, and I decided to do this crazy thing and step out on a limb and step away from teaching and risk it. Um, and anyway, that started to open up a whole bunch of different doors. I started to meet like Mike Flaherty, one of the founders of Walden Media. I ended up in Lionsgate Studios. I ended up at Kingdom Story Company talking with John Irwin. I talked with Sean Devereaux, who is this big visual effects guru who's worked on like 100 projects, all of which you've heard of. And it was just sort of like bouncing from person to person, all of whom were just kind of intrigued by this weird blend of like, you're a philosopher, you're a theologian, you're telling stories, but they're actually commercial and they're not art house projects. And like you're storyboarding them and you're doing concept art, and like, who are you? What are you doing? And so a lot of people were intrigued by that. And eventually, fast forward, long story short, some of the people who were really interested in what I was doing, even though the projects that I was trying to get off the ground sort of got put on the back burner because of COVID, which most projects did, it still got me into enough doors that at some point, Lionsgate was initiating this new project, the Wonder Project, which is now an Amazon channel. It's a joint endeavor with Amazon right now, but at the time it was initiated by Lionsgate. And the people in charge of it came to me and they were like, "Hey, we're looking for creatives. Would you be interested in a first look deal?" Which is basically, an arrangement with them where they pay me to come up with projects and work on projects and pitch projects and create projects. So I was like, I mean, sure, you want to pay me to eat candy? I guess I could. And so, so that officially marked the end of like, okay, I'm definitely working in Hollywood now. I no longer work in academia, and I'm still affiliated, like Vanderbilt, because of the influence of Peter Hodgson, the Hegel translator. He was the one who told Vanderbilt, they're like, "You should really be affiliated with him." So they brought me on as like a visiting scholar of philosophy and religion, which is why I have that affiliation. Obviously, I have my own podcast, the NathanAJacobs podcast. I still write, I still publish. I've got my Rutledge book coming out on Leibniz here. And Courtney, I hear you're familiar with some of my publications, so I have a few of those out there. But so I'm still balancing that sort of like that academic and public intellectual life. But how I pay the bills, what I do day to day is I'm writing movie scripts or noting movie scripts or working on projects or doing whatever it might be. So there you go. That's how that craziness happened.
So what I hear is if we want to get a career in Hollywood, we need to have some hallucinogenic experiences while at art school, become a
Check. Yeah.
philosopher, and eventually, because of just the instability of the job market for professional academics, just keep moving around and rubbing shoulders with Hollywood that
I
way.
couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
That's
Mhm.
yes. This is one of the reasons why when people are like, so tell me, Dr. Jacobs, how do I get to where you are? I'm like, I don't think you're going to take the same road. If you get there, it's not going to
Mhm.
be the road I took because there's anything, my road is anything but, conventional. But that's my road. That's the story.
Yeah, my first introduction to your work actually did come through, like you mentioned, Becoming Truly Human, and so your film work initially, not your, academic work, which I guess is like kind of the
Mhm.
merger of both. But
Yeah, it is.
I I personally was struggling through ministering to the religious nuns, like the spiritual, the
Mhm.
people who mark spiritual but not religious on religion surveys, and trying to figure out how to kind of help some of my youth, because I was a youth minister, from to stop prevent them from going down a path of deconstruction, beginning to
Yeah.
answer some of the questions that they were asking. And a lot of times those questions that they're asking are the same questions that, the spiritual but not religious will wrestle with. And
Mhm.
so in my opinion, your Becoming Truly Human is indispensable for anybody who's doing youth ministry today. I think it's something they
Thanks.
should watch and wrestle through, because you get people asking real questions that a lot
Mhm.
of times your students won't feel comfortable to ask out loud in a Sunday school setting.
Yeah. Well, that was actually one of the things that I loved about that project. So when I mean, I told you when it was originally pitched to me, they were basically talking about like, let's do a series of teaching videos like Alpha, and then basically they were pitching like sort of doing an Orthodox version of the Alpha program. That was what was pitched to me, and I was like, I don't think you guys understand who the religiously unaffiliated are. I'm not sure how many of them really want to go into somebody's house and be in that sort of vulnerable setting with religious people. And part of what I pitched to them, which is how, that I think one of the reasons why that film came across so authentic in terms of the stories of the nuns, right, the religiously unaffiliated, was that I just said, like, look, first of all, if you really want to engage this audience, first of all, they have to feel like they're actually seen and heard and understood, like that they're humanized people who are dealing with legitimate things, which they are. And so that's the one thing, and that was the whole point of why the film has those sort of individualized portraits. And then the second thing I was like, but then you've got to open them up to conversation. But guess who they don't want to talk to? Religious people. They're accustomed to, if I talk to mom's just worried about me, that I don't go to church, and she's got an angle, she's trying to persuade me. It's like, if you really want them to just open up and be vulnerable, you need to have them talk to each other, because they'll feel like they're amongst their peers. And yet at the same time, it's not going to be a homogenous conversation. They don't all think the same things. So it's still going to open up dialogue. It's just going to be dialogue in an unexpected way, because they've let down their guard, because they're not talking to religious people. They're talking to their peers who are also religiously unaffiliated. And I was like, so that's what you're going to have to do there. And that's also one of the reasons, obviously, you and anybody else who's seen it know that I'm in it. And so I'm facilitating those conversations, right? I'm asking people. None of the folks there knew that I was Orthodox. And the reason was because when I was interviewing them, pre-screening them, I screened like 50 or 60 nuns, candidates for the film. Whenever they'd ask, like, what do you think? Like, what are you? I was like, it doesn't matter what I'm thinking. I'm just the director of this thing. Like, it doesn't matter what I think. And so none of them knew. They knew the structure of the film. They knew there was going to be somebody who's a former unaffiliated person who finds religion. They didn't know that was me. And I think that's one of the reasons they ended up trusting me, because they had already had a sit down with me, and I never at any point, tried to, hoist anything onto them. Right. It was just sort of, I'm curious about what your story is and what you think. And so over time they became vulnerable, and I thought it was really great to be able to capture that, in film. So
I agree. And if you go and watch the documentary, also, I would suggest, and I suggest this to anyone who I've recommended the film to, is to go and watch your 3-part lecture series that you did, the Midwest OCA Clergy Conference, where you talk about the film and the background to the film, more information about the nuns, the spiritual but not religious, but particularly episode 2, where you kind of get into some of their theological objections,
yeah.
and how to address those from kind of a history of ideas approach in the history of theology.
Yeah.
It's just a very helpful breakdown. It really put together a lot
Thanks.
of, it tied together a lot of threads that had felt very loose to me.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, as I've talked about there and in other contexts, I think a lot of times the way folks see the unaffiliated isn't quite right. Um, but yeah, anyway, yeah, in that series, I try to help an entire room full of clergy understand what I think is really going on with them.
Which it just can be very hard if you've always been religious and felt spiritual and felt at home in your religious community to begin
Hmm.
to ask those questions as
Yeah.
if you're, putting on their shoes and walking a mile in them. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but moving on to some of the other maybe projects you've worked on, or even projects you've seen from afar, because
Hmm.
this is something that's becoming kind of the norm. Maybe not documentary style per se, but kind of getting into religious filmmaking and religious
Right.
storytelling, whether it's in an episodic fashion with The Chosen or House of David or other series like that, or if it's movies, everything from like The Passion of the Christ to the Mary movie that recently came out, or some other movies. And I
Uh-huh.
even think of some shows or series that maybe people wouldn't think are religious initially, but something like Called the Midwife,
Hmm.
where the religious life of these Anglican nuns just really is the undergirding and underpinning of the entire show and this entire
Yeah.
community that the show is built on. So
Yeah.
those are things that people wouldn't
Or even
necessarily think.
Shogun, you
Oh
know?
yeah, yeah. There's
Yeah.
so many.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so, like, how do you classify some of these Hollywood portrayals of biblical stories, just in terms of Hollywood storytelling? And
Yeah.
then I'd also like to kind of on the back end of that say, how should we receive them as story watchers? So what is like a Christian perspective on receiving those stories?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a few different ways I would categorize them. Like on the one hand, I think there's a long history of people looking at religious films and thinking of them as just bad, and I don't think they always know why it feels bad. They'll use things like, "Well, it feels saccharine," or "It feels like that it's poorly made," or "It feels preachy," right? And those are pretty common criticisms of it. And candidly, they're completely valid criticisms of it. I don't watch faith-based projects, like things that are labeled that. It's like I have such a low tolerance. Even people who have a low tolerance, like one of my buddies, the producer Sean Devereaux, always tells me, I was like, "Yeah, man, I can't handle it." He's like, "Well," he's like, "Your tolerance is even lower than mine. Like, you just have a clear allergy to anything that even smells like it's an agenda-driven sort of like preachy project." I think in terms of that, a lot of what people are encountering in those sort of early forms when they thought about faith-based films is, on the one hand, yes, there was a quality issue there just because it typically wasn't high budget projects, although that's not always true, right? Like 10 Commandments for the time was like a big budget, big Hollywood, project. Ben-Hur was a big Hollywood project. So that wasn't always the case. But I think for people for whom that's like not like that's whatever got replayed on television when I was a kid, or my parents told me about it or something like that. That's not part of their cultural memory. For a lot of us, at least in my generation, which I'm older than you, I'm sure, Courtney, by a significant margin, though I don't know exactly how much. It's I have this memory of faith-based projects are the sort of thing that like my mom would go and like, I'm going to send a message to Hollywood and I'm going to go support by going to the theater to see this terrible movie. And that's how I thought about it. And it's like, please don't make me watch that. Like, I'm not going to get those 2 hours back and I'm going to be crawling out of my skin. And like, if you're hoping that I want to become a Christian by the end of this, the opposite is actually the result. And so I think that's what a lot of people like me associate with faith-based projects. And on the one hand, there is a quality issue there in those older forms. That's true. That's starting to change because studios are starting to recognize that there's money to be made, and so they're putting more money behind them. But I think the other thing when it comes to like either the saccharine side of it, or to the preachy side, I think those are that's sort of two different layers there, right? So you have the quality issue that can be addressed, and it often is being addressed. In terms of the saccharine issue, I think there's a certain sense in which a lot of people feel like there is a certain sensibility that a lot of Christians have, especially, and when we use Christians in entertainment, usually it means evangelicals because they're the ones who are mainly driving the faith-based market. And so there's a certain sensibility that there is a sensitivity to profanity, to sex, to violence, right? That's there in the evangelical culture. And so even if you're going to tell a story that's dicey, it can only be so dicey, right? Like it can't offend a 30-something-year-old soccer mom, because that's who's going to watch this. And so the threshold for like realism and grit and the sort of like existential dark struggle, like those are beyond the bounds of the storytelling, because those might be offensive. Those realities might be sort of thing they wouldn't want to watch. And so I think what you get is you get this constricting of what the storytelling is, which either gets you a really inauthentic version of that story when somebody tries to tell it, because we got to tell the sanitized version of it, or we just don't tell those stories. And so you've got to go to somebody else. You got to go to secular storyteller to tell those stories, which is really tragic. I mean, you look at Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. There's some dicey characters in there. So there are wonderful stories. I have a very dark aesthetic, probably too dark. My godfather is worried. He's like, I think we need to find you a new muse, because I'm pretty sure your muse is a demon. But but so I have a dark aesthetic. But again, it's like, so the sort of stories and the sort of realism, the sort of topics you can talk about get constricted, and that's where you get the saccharine side, where it's only these types of stories that are socially acceptable and non-offensive. Or if we're going to tell darker stories, they're not really dark, and in that sense, they come across as fake, as plastic. And so that's what's going on there. And then in terms of the preachy thing, people use preachy, but I think they just mean propaganda. And by propaganda, I just mean straightforward, like it's agenda first, right? Like there is a message I'm trying to tell you. There's a sales pitch I'm trying to make. Now, what's the story I can tell around that to get there? And I think that really comes through to audiences. And it's not unique to faith-based stuff. Like you can sit there and watch, some Hollywood movie about, environmentalism, or about, some political issue, whatever it might be. And that, like, okay, you're not really telling me this story. You're telling me what I should think, how I should vote, right? You're guilting me about something. Like this is actually you just preaching to me. And I think that comes through whenever a story does that. People can tell whether or not, are you telling the story, or are you like telling me a message, making a sales pitch, and you're just packaging it in a story. And I think one of the things is that Christian filmmakers, evangelical filmmakers of a certain generation, what people think of as faith-based, have tended to be like, well, in order to be a Christian filmmaker, I need to be saying something that's Christian. I've got to have a sales pitch. I mean, otherwise, what am I doing here? Then I'm just a secular filmmaker. And that's why all of a sudden what you get is you get that, story first, message first sort of approach, which means you're doing propaganda. Like that is what you're doing. And people don't like propaganda. I mean, I'll just tell you, like, people don't like it. I'll just tell you, that's not the case. So I think those are sort of I think there's 3 different layers and 3 different problems there. Now, in terms of what's changing now, I think some of that's changing. Some of it has yet to change. I think Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ was one of those things that really blew a lot of people's minds, because it felt like it didn't fall prey to any of those issues. Like it felt like, okay, there was no holding back in terms of like, don't offend the soccer moms. Like this is a hard R movie, and not gratuitously. I know some people thought it was gratuitous, but like there is a case to be made that he's just portraying the brutality of what's really going on. So in terms of like that boundary lines that's like, you can't tell the story the way it really is, that wasn't there. In terms of the quality, well, it was Mel Gibson. He was Hollywood. Like, I mean, it doesn't get any more Hollywood than Mel Gibson. And so I think those 2 issues were immediately there. And then in terms of like the propaganda side, I don't think anybody felt like they were being preached at. They thought like, I'm getting an authentic portrayal of Mel Gibson's Catholic faith. Like it's very Catholic. I know that. But I didn't get a sales pitch that said, and now you go become Catholic, right? Like, it's just like, this is just what the Catholics think about this, right? And so I think for that reason, that's one of the reasons why it hit so big with so many people, because it didn't fall into any of those pits, right? Like it dodged all those. Now I think the problem is Hollywood has never understood that. And I know this firsthand, from, talking to managers, talking to studios, like, I've had meetings with Universal, for example, where they were like, okay, we want to move into the faith space. And like, and I've shown them a project, and they're like, okay, It's really high end, super cool, totally get it, think it would work. Just think it's too dark. I was like, well, what was the part that was too dark? I think it was the part where they started sacrificing children to Moloch. I was like, oh, that part. Okay. I mean, I guess, I mean, we could get rid of the infant murder, but like, and so like, I've seen it firsthand with Hollywood, where like they too are sort of projecting in the sense of, well, we can't alienate a certain audience. So if we go too dark, they don't want it. I had a meeting with managers where I was talking to them, sort of post House of David, which I'm obviously affiliated with. And I was talking with them about sort of my vision for how I would approach filmmaking and some of the things I just talked to you about with regard to Mel Gibson. And they were just like, I just don't know. I just think that, that America isn't ready for that. And they just want PG Bible stories, or something like that. And so Hollywood has in their mind that sort of thing. There's also just the fact that Hollywood in general is risk averse. And so Mel Gibson works out, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, let's throw some money at like Ridley Scott doing Moses. And then somehow in the room, and as comical as this is, like, I can see it. I've been in enough Hollywood rooms to know where they're like, no, it'd be great. What if like Moses, like, what if it's a head injury? And like, maybe we don't really know if it's God. Like maybe it's not a burning bush. Maybe it's a little kid that shows up and he's just pitching it to him. And maybe it's like, it's up to you. Like, was it really God? Like, or was it just a hallucination? Yeah, that'll go over great. It didn't go over great. Like that's, or, Aronofsky, and it's like, let's hire, an atheist Jew to do the story of Noah and make it about environmentalism. And it's like, you could have been like, oh no, I think we could have pretty much told you could just pile up your money and light it on fire right now. You don't have to make the movie in order to do that. And then because Hollywood tries that and they try it on their own and they get burned, then they're like, I don't know, let's just hire somebody who knows how to do it. And in that sense, because Mel Gibson is like a guy who doesn't do that all the time, who do you turn to? Well, you turn to the people who have a track record with the faith-based audience, with evangelicals, and you continue to get the sort of PG style, soft PG-13 sort of stuff that is a base hit. Now, I think the thing is, like, Mel Gibson shows that if you do it right, if you avoid all those pitfalls and you do it, you have a massive audience. You probably have the biggest audience in the world. I mean, that's one of the highest grossing films of all time. The other ones that are base hits, and like studios are okay with base hits. Like they have enough fails and money losses that, yeah, if we know we're going to get our money back and a little bit of a bump, that's not too bad. Sure, let's go with the safe bet. And so I think for that reason, people like myself who are like, I don't want to do that. I want to do more something like this. Why there's always a barrier with studios of convincing them that you're right, because none of them want to actually take that risk.
Yeah, it's gosh, that Noah movie brings back some memories. That was like came out in seminary for me. So a group of us went to watch it, and the Nephilim portrayal in that, where they're like rock spider creatures or something like it was just odd. You're like, what's going on?
The Jim Henson rock people, like
they kind of look like spiders at the same time. You're just like, what is this?
What is this? Yes, there was a lot of what is this with that project. I mean, I know for a lot of people who aren't familiar with like the Book of Enoch, they were like, really, what is this? But even for those of us who knew it, we were still like, what is this?
Yeah.
Other than an idea.
Before Courtney jumps into some of the more technical breakdowns of why this is, I'm just kind of wondering, because I've been spending some time. I'd been doing a series walking through Torah, and we just did the thing about why Leviticus matters, and it is the messiness of the Bible translating into something that people can interact with. The challenge of that and how narrative can kind of help us navigate that, messiness and holding the difficulty of that messiness in those stories.
Yeah. So, how do I tell this story? Okay, I have a story that I want to tell on that point. I'm trying to figure out how to veil it appropriately. So I would say this. One of the things that I think is very difficult about really telling Bible stories to a contemporary audience in a way that matters is that the Hollywood temptation is to make it identifiable. right? Like, so let's turn it into, a love story, and, we're going to go and elope, or, like, Romeo and Juliet. Like, they'll try to do something like that sort of thing. And I think the difficulty is that the more immersive and engaging way of telling a story, which is something that, again, like Hollywood, it involves risk, and it involves a certain level of sophistication that, truthfully, a lot of studios are adverse to. Like, they have an allergy to it. Is that you have to make the audience actually care, right, about something. So, like, let's just say, for example, that you wanted to tell the story of, like, Joshua and, purging the land of Canaan. You would actually have to first figure out how to make the audience care about that and think that Joshua and God are the good guys in that story. Because if you just sort of thrust them into a story where it's like, yeah, genocide, like, clearly they're the good guys, right? Like, that's that's not going to land. And so, in order to actually tell that story in a way that is compelling to a modern audience and help them to really understand it, not just the beats that are there, not the characters, not the lines, but to really understand the meaning of that story in a deeper way, you would actually have to help them to see the events the way God wants you to see the events in the story. And that's a much higher bar. I think it can absolutely be done, but it oftentimes requires going into weird spaces, in terms of the background, in terms of the culture, in terms of the lore, go into very uncomfortable and dark and gritty places, that, again, would make people very uncomfortable in terms of the culture and the practices and things like that. But I think that's sort of like the real thing that if you were to tell the stories the most effective, you would have to introduce them to that world the way the scriptures want you to see that world. And once that lens shift is there, you're going to have to let it be as weird and alien as it is. There's a sense, and I don't think that's a bad thing. A lot of people love Dune, but part of what they love about Dune is how weird it is. They're like, I don't know what's quite going on, but man, it's weird, and I just want more of this crazy, weird world. And so I think when you're talking about the sorts of stories that you're talking about, Amber, when you're talking about these Old Testament stories, allowing those stories and that world to be as weird and strange and, immersive, as it actually would be for us, I think is key. And I think that becomes an important part of the world building of it. And then also utilizing that world building to help people actually have the lens shift where they're like, yeah, okay, I think I actually do now understand what's happening in the story. And without that, I think you're just relying on, all you're doing is you're relying on the fact that you hope your audience believes the Bible. And they're like, well, yeah, obviously Joshua is the good guy because when I read the Bible, Joshua is the good guy. And that's probably not good enough.
Yeah, I think that PG impulse, though, also exists, just kind of coming from someone who's led the evangelical space for a while with, but also it has a mind towards, the Old Testament and kind of the lament and the Psalms and all of that wrestling that goes on there. It exists even in the music that's produced for, like, Christian music, is to say, well, we know that we need to deal with a lot of these emotions that people are dealing with, but the only songs that we're going to really sing on a Sunday morning are those songs that give us a certain, lighter feeling to be happy about God or think good thoughts about God. And we just, I don't really know, generally speaking, how most people deal with those kind of deeper emotions or darker thoughts or darker episodes in the Bible. But I think a lot of times for most people in their real lives, they kind of just get pushed to the side. So it's not just like, maybe your muse is a little dark, but maybe some people need that muse to be explored a little bit in art, so they can see, like, Christians can actually think and reflect on these things, and it's something we can wrestle with.
No, I mean, I think it is like my muse hopefully is not a demon, but like my muse, it is as dark as my aesthetic is. Like, I'm not suggesting everybody has to look no, not everybody has to or even should. Let's say my projects get made, the ones that I'm working on. I'm not suggesting they're for everybody, but I do think they are aimed at something that's really important, which is to say, like, if you're really going to engage certain aspects of the story, the stories that are there, you have to go into very dark places because the stories themselves are really, really dark. I kind of every night at dinner with my kids. We read the Bible together, and they've been wanting to go chronologically. Like, let's go through the whole Bible. I was like, all right, we're going to be here for a long time, guys, but if that's what you want, all right. And so So we've been doing that, and just some of the stories. Like, oh my gosh, the shifting in the seats. I mean, and it, I mean, the funny thing, like everything from Lot and his daughters to, like, I mean, Sodom and Gomorrah itself is obviously, every beat of that story is like jaw drop. If you pause to think about what the actual events are, you're like, what? And it would, and if you think that's just an outlier, it's like, no, it's like story after story after story of like, what on earth is going.
And you're not even to the book of Judges yet, or like Judges 19.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, buckle up, boys and girls. Like, it's gonna get wilder. Yeah. So
yeah, so I feel like maybe, Amber, this is a really good time to ask Joshua Davidson's question about your favorite untold story in the Bible, since we're talking about you're reading the Bible to your kids and all these good things.
Wait, my favorite untold story in the
like untold in film, or that's been adapted to screen. Yeah. It's easy to go to the Moses or the David.
It is.
Right.
Okay, so I don't know if I can say that they're my favorites, but I'll say like a couple of projects that I wanted to tell. I mean, the reason I brought up Joshua is because I do have in the works right now, in development right now. And again, like, there's a lot of projects that go through the development stage and get stuck there. And so can't say for sure that any of these will get made, but I do really particularly love the Nephilim story, and the entire Noahic flood story and everything that's going on there. And so I have a project very much related to that. It's not like Aronofsky's. It's very different than that. I love that project. And I love that story. And I think there's right now a lot of deep fascination, sort of in the culture and online, about pre-flood cultures, lost technologies, all this sort of overlap and all these different stories about, peoples or gods that come and mingle with, women, and, all these sort of the sorts of things that are there in the Hebrew Bible, but also in other stories as well. And so I love that. I'm fascinated with that in a similar way as others. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in that story is because another story like the story of Joshua that I'd like to tell, or, the story of Moses, I think you need that sort of background. I think there's a tendency to jump into those stories, like the story of Moses, without understanding what's going on in terms of the gods of the nations, and in terms of like what's going on there, or in the land of Canaan, or whatever it is. And so I very much I'm really passionate about the idea of telling that story, from like the sort of pre-Noahic side up through like where you're into the story of Joshua, in order to actually see it in a new way, mainly because I think it's such critical background for all the things that follow after that, including David. And so, so that's an area where I don't know that I'd say it's my favorite untold story, but it's definitely my favorite of the projects that I want to tell. This is ridiculous. Am I actually going to say this publicly? I guess I will. I really do want to do like a Monty Python style version of Sodom and Gomorrah, and just tell that story without modifying at all, and just let the comedy and the hilarity of it be that, yeah, that's really the story. I have that project in the works too.
Yeah,
very different.
That would be so awesome. I would be on board for either of those two. I can see the Nephilim one just instantly having just a million people who'd want to watch that, even if they aren't Christians, just because that's something everybody's talking about now.
Yeah, that's right.
But the Monty Python, that would be really funny. I could also see a Monty Python type take on Jonah, because it's pretty ridiculous when you're reading it in Hebrew.
Jonah's awesome.
Jonah is a great story.
The satire in Jonah is amazing.
Yes, I especially like when at the end he's like, when he's pissing and moaning, he's like, because I knew you were going to do this, because you're merciful and you're compassionate, and you love
people.
You didn't. so furious you didn't wipe out the Ninevites. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, it's a great story. That's a great one too.
Yep. And it's, just to get a little bit of Hebrew Bible nerdy, since that's what some of our audience is here for today.
Okay.
There's this Hebrew verb shuv, which means to turn, return, or repent. But God can shuv in the Hebrew Bible. And it means that he, repents or relents of the judgment that he's planned because they've repented. And so in the book of Jonah, everybody shuvs except for Jonah. The only way that Jonah goes back when he should have been going towards Nineveh is because, the whale shooves
by coercion.
The fish shooves. So even the fish shooves in Jonah, but Jonah's just like, I'd rather get vomited up by this whale than actually go.
Right.
That's right.
Exactly.
Like the cows shoe, all the livestock shoe. Everybody shoes except for Jonah. And so yeah, no, that's really good. And I even think, so the opposite end of, all that breakdown that you just gave us of like the types of different Hollywood storytelling is also the reception by the audience, because there tends to be like just a wide range of Christian perceptions of Christian biblical portrayals, so there's everything for the, like, I'm going to love it because I'm a Christian and I'm just going to, just love it and want to have a t-shirt for every character and all these kinds of things, which is cool. Like, I'm cool with that too. So even if it's like bad and not good, in that category. But then some people, because especially like if you think about Mel Gibson's Passion, which this wasn't something that I necessarily heard as a Baptist who, everybody in my church loved the Passion movie, but there are things about it that incorporate things of church history and tradition or specific Catholic portrayals, like the Stations of the Cross in it. And some people are like, well, that's not biblical, so it's not good, and therefore we shouldn't like it. But then, there's kind of this other way that we talked about maybe like a month ago on our Hebrew Bible breakdown series. That's like, this is meant to foster our Christian imagination and to help us reimagine these stories in new ways so that we can, inhabit them. And I just wonder, what's your take on how we should receive these things? What's the interplay between like tradition and what we find and kind of in the biblical text? How do we build these details out and all those kinds of things?
Yeah. So you're definitely right. There is a contingent that's like activist, and they're like, send a message to Hollywood. Now, I don't know if they know the message they're sending to Hollywood. I mean, I think the message is like, you guys have really bad taste and you'll pay for it. Like, you'll pay for bad movies. Sometimes that's the message that Hollywood gets. I remember one of the guys, I've worked with a couple of different folks, quite a few folks who worked with Harvey Weinstein. And Harvey used to say, so I'm told, I never worked with Harvey directly, but they used to say that, Harvey used to say, I don't see red, I don't see, blue, I only see green. And so like Harvey didn't care, right? Like complete pragmatist when it comes to how to sell a project. And Hollywood is that way. Like Amazon, for all of their, sort of, whatever they might think about Christians or whatever, if Christians are tuning in to House of David, they're like, great, your money's as good as anyone's, right? There's no objection to that sort of thing. So I definitely think there's this, I'll support it if it's Christian contingent. And then I think there's other people like me who have an allergy to it. And it's like, oh, if it's overtly sort of like advertised as Christian, I won't see it because I just doubt I could stomach it. And I'm probably an overcorrector in that sort of way, but in terms of, the folks who are in between, I think there's a couple of different issues here. Like one of the things is that, because I'm opposed to the sort of like propagandized thing, I'm definitely an art first sort of person in the sense of saying like, and this goes to the point that I was talking about how so often faith-based stuff is propagandistic in the sense of we've got a message, there's a thing I want to say, like this is the thing. And now I'm coming up with a story to sort of package it in, and that comes through. And like I said, that was amongst the many things that the Passion got correct, was that Mel Gibson was clearly not doing that. He was just sort of presenting his theology and doing that sort of thing. And so I clearly, because, I wasn't Catholic at the time, I'm not Catholic now. But I still love that project because I recognize it as good art and I recognize it as Catholic art, but I still recognize it as good art. And so I think when a project is done correctly, when it's done properly, it's able to be engaged and to be viewed and be recognized for what it is, which is a story told from a certain perspective and told well. I think Dostoevsky is very much this way. Obviously, I'm Orthodox. Dostoevsky's Orthodox, and so I resonate with the worldview that's there. But a lot of people who aren't Orthodox resonate with Dostoevsky because it just feels authentic in some way. And I think that sort of authenticity that says like this is a certain type of story being told from a certain type of perspective. I think there's nothing wrong with engaging projects in that way, where it's like, okay, let's look at this. This is an authentic story being told. But I do think that there's let's just say for a minute that check. It's good art, right? It's actually, actually is art. It's not propaganda. Check there, right? It really is just sort of telling a story from a certain perspective. It's committing to a certain reading of the text or whatever it might be. And so we've got high quality, we've got non-propagandistic, right? Like we've got, we've got these sort of check boxes going. I think once you've done that, like there's still a certain ethical boundary line to it. And this is the sort of thing that I've talked about, like in my podcast, where I talk about like Hollywood taxidermy, which is that I really do think there's a certain sense in which you need to recognize that certain stories being told are not your stories. So if I want to, for example, tell some sort of like fantasy story, and I've got the money to buy the rights to, I don't know, we'll say Tolkien, and I'm going to call it Tolkien because I know that that's useful from a marketing perspective. I'm going to say like, yeah, it's Tolkien. People like Tolkien, right? You like Tolkien, you'll pay to see Tolkien, right? But then I'm going to basically hollow out Tolkien. And I'm going to tell my own story, and I'm going to, change the characters, and I'm going to change the lore and all that. And in this sense, it's really the reason I call it Hollywood taxidermy is because you're taking something that's alive and thriving, you're killing it, gutting it, and then sort of like stuffing it. It's like this very Buffalo Bill, like I'm going to wear around the skin of this person sort of thing. And it's a horror show, and people hate that for good reason. And I think that's actually unethical because it's not really yours. You want to tell a story with dwarves and elves and build a world and whatever, then tell that. But if you're going to actually handle somebody else's material, then you need to respect the fact that it's not yours. And I think, legally you can do it. Ethically, I don't think you can. And I think the same is true when it comes to how much more when it comes to the biblical text. It's not yours, right? And so it should be handled the same way in which somebody like Peter Jackson was concerned with honoring the source material. You can disagree with how he read it. You can disagree with how he interpreted certain things, but he was clearly concerned with trying to do justice to it and be fair to it and uphold it and recognize it wasn't his. And so I think the same, how much more should that care be taken when it comes to something like the biblical text? And so I don't think the biblical text should ever be handled as just a vehicle for telling your own story, just a vehicle for, creating your own characters, just a vehicle for building your own world, any of that sort of stuff. I think that's actually unethical. And in that case, it's moving beyond sort of the typical unethical into like the blasphemous. So I think that's a very real danger. Now, that said, the biblical text, there is, if you're going to, as an artist, go ahead and deal with it and tell the story. Now, let's say you are going to honor the biblical text and you are going to honor it in the way it deserves, sort of gravity it deserves. The fact of the matter is that filling in those dots between the beats of the story is required. Like we take for granted, for example, when you're, reading a story that, okay, well, the Philistines show up and, they've got superior numbers and they've got giants and there's 40 days. Like they wait 40 days. Okay, well, why do they wait 40 days? Well, the text doesn't explicitly tell you why they wait 40 days, right? Like, and so now you actually have to, if you're going to tell that story in a way that's compelling, you actually have to dig into the question of saying like causally, why? Like motivationally, why? Like, why don't they just invade? Like, why are they letting Goliath do this? Why is Goliath concerned about this in the first place? And you start to realize when you ask those storytelling questions that there's a lot of gaps in the biblical text because the biblical text isn't a novel. It's not a movie script. It's not trying to answer those things. It's telling you these critical things that happen. related to what it's doing, but it's not giving you a fully fleshed out Dostoevsky style, story. And so if you're going to start to tell it in a way, you actually have to put flesh on some of those bones. And this is where I think it goes to the responsibility of a storyteller. If you're really going to do that well, there is a way of doing that in a way that honors the source material, which is to get to know, things like the actual ancient Near Eastern background, the actual culture, the actual scholarship, the actual lore. Maybe consider some of the traditions that have cared for this, like Jewish midrash or, church history or whatever it is, and try to come up with plausible ways of connecting that. Now, that's not going to give you a definitive answer oftentimes, because anybody who's dug into like rabbinic tradition knows there's lots of different traditions, because basically you have a bunch of rabbis sitting around going, well, why is this? And they're asking the same questions, and they don't all come up with the same answers. But if you're involved in that conversation, you're at least doing justice to the culture that has handed it down, the people who have practiced this. You're learning the ancient Near East, you're doing that sort of thing, and you're building out this world in a way that is plausibly in keeping with the connective tissue of the text. Then at least you're still honoring the text. You're deferring to something that is outside of yourself. You're deferring to the actual culture. You're deferring to the actual history. You're deferring to the actual religious traditions and so on. And I think that's how a person goes ahead and honors something like that, where you have to engage in some level of creative license. I think where things get unethical is if you just start to make stuff up, you start to get anachronistic, you start to connect pieces that, are actually violative of the source material and things like that. That's where I think you move into unethical territory that's problematic. And I think that's part of what differentiates good from bad storytelling, if you're going to bring those things to light.
Sorry, well, yeah, I added that just sparked another question, because like one of the things that we run into quite a bit when we're trying to interact and explain things in the Hebrew Bible, and anytime you touch anything that's outside of what someone's definition of canon is, and you go into looking at the pseudepigrapha, you're looking into Temple Judaism literature, you start looking at the early church fathers, and certain groups start freaking out because that's not the Bible. You can't use that in a Bible story. Like that balance of how do we hold this? No, we're not saying this is authority on the same level of scripture, but it still helps us fill in and guess at some of those gaps that are left intentionally by the biblical authors. But that is the themes of that are carried out in those other places. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean,
before you answer that, I just want to say, I don't think that this is just like some groups. This is something you can even find in commentaries where, like John chapter 4 with the Samaritan woman, there's a really great explanation as to some of the answers, why Jesus is having this conversation with her based on some of the early church traditions surrounding her, or Pilate's wife and why she has a dream and how that dream affects like the trial of Jesus, or even like David's mother. And these are, Jewish traditions prior to the time of Christ. And so you'll see these like often just footnoted in commentaries, and they don't make it into the actual discussion of what the text could mean. So it's not just like, groups that might have kind of an allergy to pseudepigrapha. It's even commentators who are reading those materials, but they kind of footnote it as like, this can't really be part of what this text is getting at.
Yeah. And I think it's sort of an odd thing. So I think it's kind of this, I think it's largely a product. I mean, obviously it's a product of Protestantism and a deep concern for sola scriptura and not sort of adding traditions and things like that. But I think one of the things that gets lost in there, which is, I talked about this not too long ago. I did an episode on the Connectly sort of viral clip where an Orthodox guy was talking with Cliff and Stewart. And in there, at least part of what I talked about in there was just sort of like methodologically, let's put aside scripture. Like, let's pretend that we're not religious people with vested interests in in this religion. Let's say we just discover this religion, we'll call it the religion of Havnir. And when we discovered this religion of Havnir, we're like, okay, we've got a bunch of sacred texts and we're trying to figure out what they're doing. and I'm reading the texts, and it looks like, I mean, the best I can tell, right? Like it looks like these were the practices and these were the beliefs and things like that. But you know what we also found, which is really great, is we found like thousands of pages of writings from people who like lived in that culture and who like practiced the religion and who actually assembled those religious texts and knew the people who were the founders of it and things like that. That's a really great resource. We should read that too. And, you know, maybe that would help us understand the text. And I might discover like there's certain things, the text sounded like it was saying this to me, but obviously it's not, because like nobody in any of these other materials we're reading thinks that. And what they do think is this, and that's actually really illuminating. And so like methodologically, that would be the obvious choice for how you for how you handle something. Like just best practices as a historian, like that's what you would obviously do. And you would never sit there and go, well, I'm going to read the text in isolation and then say that everybody else who lived it and practiced it and assembled the text is wrong, because clearly I understand this better than them who actually like lived it. And, you know, so on. Like nobody would say that. That would be obviously absurd. So methodologically, that would be an obvious choice. I think that the challenge is, of course, that Protestantism is predicated on this entire thing of saying like it was corrupted, you know, church tradition is, you know, unreliable, it went off the rails. And so we've got to get back to the text and we've got to read it because it's the only sort of safe haven of that sort of thing. And I think that's where you start to get the origin of this dichotomy between the reliable stuff and the unreliable stuff. Now, that said, I do believe in sacred scripture. I think sacred scripture is God breathed. You know, I do agree. I do believe Paul on that, right? You know, that's so I am of that mind, and I understand that there's a differentiation there. But to somehow then, as a result, have like a fear or an allergy to other early Christian literature, or you know, other sort of, you know, intertemporal literature, or like intertestamental literature, or something like that, really is to start to, I think, become an overcorrection, where it's like that's fine. You know, acknowledge the fact that the biblical text doesn't answer this question. Okay, good. We can all agree here that the biblical text says certain things and leaves certain gaps. And I think anybody who doesn't recognize that hasn't really wrestled with the text from a narratival perspective. Because I think really what you end up finding out is like the moment you start to, you know, the moment you start to engage with the text from like a narratival perspective, you start to realize how many holes are there in the narrative that really need to be filled out. That's why the rabbis are asking that question, being somebody who's been in a writer's room trying to figure out how you're going to flesh out the narrative. Like that's obviously the sort of thing, like there are gaps in there that you have to answer that the text doesn't answer. And so I think it's fine to acknowledge, well, the text answers this and it doesn't answer that. It's fine to sort of bracket in your mind that this is very clearly like a firm, unshakable commitment of the biblical text. And it's sacred, right? It's sacred scripture. And this is not, right? Like, and that this is sort of an explanatory gap that's being filled in. I think it's fine to make those sorts of differentiations, but the idea of being afraid to somehow look at the possible connective tissues, I think it's just the reality that you have to wrestle with those connective gaps. And that goes back to this thing that I had recommended about, you know, Mel Gibson. I think at the end of the day, if you're going to be a storyteller and you're going to engage the biblical text and tell a story, you're going to have to make certain commitments. At some point, you're going to have to say, well, there's this theory and there's that theory, and, you know, and at some point we're going to have to commit and actually tell the story from a particular perspective. Mel Gibson told the story of the Passion from a Catholic perspective. I disagree with aspects of that. That's fine. He's Catholic. I'm not, right? But it doesn't discount, you know, the validity of that as a tremendous work of art that is, you know, ultimately telling that story from a committed position. And I think that's sort of the key, you know.
Yeah, so I personally have wondered what is that, like, as we wrestle with the line between, like, what we call historiography today, some kind of, like, methodological, like, this is fact, this is truth,
Yeah.
and hagiography or church tradition, like, what is a way that we can, like, philosophically think through how the ancients thought about truth or myth or symbol and these kinds of things when it seems like they're putting kind of unrealistic facts next to things that they probably think are true facts, and it's all in one story,
Yeah.
right? But that's just my, like, probably, a certain kind of framing I'm giving that question. But
Yeah. Well, it's okay. So it is kind of interesting. I see two different sort of questions, at least embedded in that question, right? Like, because the one has to do with like how you approach it, and I do think again this is kind of an inversion of what happens when you look at the early church fathers and how they deal with it versus how sort of somebody influenced by Protestantism deals with it. So in Protestantism, because there is a skepticism about tradition and the reliability of what's been handed down, there's a tendency to go back to the biblical text in order to find something that's been lost. And so there's this presumption that we don't really know what Christianity is. It's buried somewhere back in that text and been muddied by all of this other stuff. And so that's why we got to clear away that stuff. And the more we can clear away, the better, so that we can get into the biblical text and really sort of use fresh lenses and see what we can discover, because it's been lost and it's buried. That's very different than the way the Eastern Church Fathers approach it. So, I mean, people like Irenaeus, for example, I mean, he points out, look, we were already doing this whole thing called Christianity before we had written text. Obviously, we had the Old Testament, right? Okay, we had that, fine, but like when we look at the biblical text, we're not looking at it to find out what Christianity is. We already know what Christianity is. We're looking at it, bringing what we already know about Christ to it. So, he criticizes the Gnostics, right? This famous part where the Gnostics, he describes it like they come along and they find a mosaic of Christ and they reshuffle the tiles and they turn it into a dog. And they're like, see, Jesus is a dog. And Irenaeus is like, well, it's really fascinating that you can do that with those tiles. But I mean, the problem is we already know that Jesus is not a dog. And so, so he's like, fascinating though that is, that's not really terribly, that's not how we approach it. We're not approaching it to find out who Jesus is. We already know Christ. In a similar way, one of the analogies I've used sometimes when trying to help, at least in the past with students, to help them grasp this, I was like, well, let's just pretend that at some point, like you and I go into business and we start like doing business, and we never really go to the trouble of putting together like this operating agreement or bylaws or anything. We're just kind of doing business the way we do business. And whenever there's an issue, we send each other an email, or we send a department an email or something like that. And at some point, we're sitting here going, we're getting old, and I think this company is actually going to outlive us. Like, I didn't think that was going to happen. Like, I really thought this was going to be a short-term thing, but it looks like the company is going to outlive us. We should probably like assemble some stuff for the people after us to know how to run the business. And so we start to print out all our emails and we bind them together and we put them into a book and we distribute them. We're like, here's our operating agreement. You can reference this for how we do business. And then at some point, some guy comes along and he sits down in your office and he's like, hey, so Dr. Jacob, I've been looking through the handbook here, and I noticed that one of the things we do is we do this here. This is how we do business. And you're like, oh, no, that's actually not how we do business. I mean, like, I understand how you could read it that way. Like, I get it. Right. Like, but no, that's not what that's saying. That's not how we do business. It's like, no, it is. Look here, and let me get out the dictionary and show you what this word means. And then I'm going to sentence diagram this for you. And then like, you'll see, like, clearly that's how you do business. And he's like, no, look, again, I understand grammatically or whatever, how you're getting there, but like, it's just not how we do business. That's not what that's saying. And then he's like, well, this is clearly a corrupt organization. I'm going to go start my own business that does it right. That's kind of like the difference between the way the church fathers see it and the way the others do. And this actually comes through in somebody like Basil of Caesarea in, I think it's his treatise on the Holy Spirit, where he draws the distinction between dogma and kerygma, which is like most people tend to think of like teaching and preaching. And they're like, yeah, like dogmatics, like where you have like the systematic theology type thing or something like that. And then what you preach. Whereas for Basil, when he's looking at that, dogma is actually the lived practices of the church. It's just what we do. And then kerygma is when we've gotten into a dispute with a heretic and we actually have to articulate what we do. And so the irony is that dogma was always just the lived faith of the church, which is one of the reasons he'll appeal to hymnody or to liturgy or things like that, because that was theology as far as they were concerned. It wasn't just this sort of limited, sort of written data from the apostles. And so I think there's, on the one hand, there's that sort of difference that's going on where the one group is saying, like, we approach the text not to discover what Christianity is, but we approach it knowing what it is. Like, we bring that to the text. Just like if I read my father's memoirs, I'm bringing to those memoirs what I already know of him. I'm not like, yes, I'll learn things about him, sure, things about his past that I didn't know, but I'm not bracketing everything that I know about him from experience. I'm bringing all of that into how I read the text. And so I think that's one, major difference that you start to find there in terms of how it's approached. So that's one of the things. Now, so I'm going back to your question here. So you brought up this question. The one had to do with, like, remind me, because there was a second point that I saw.
Yeah, like that relationship between hagiography and historiography. Were they doing that thing? Because some people will kind of dismiss them, or, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, some of the stories, if you read them yourselves, they sound kind of improbable. Like,
right.
I don't know, somebody jumped into the ocean and then was taken by a dolphin to some other place,
Sure.
and something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, I think on that point, in terms of like the things going on there with hagiography, I would say like a couple of things. First of all, in terms of hagiography, it's not treated at the level of scripture. Like, so there are a lot of traditions that are commemorated, but I don't think anybody really sort of, first of all, it's not like the whole of the faith hangs on, whether or not this story and tradition is there. It's not sort of elevated to that level. But also, and so I think there's that. And there's clearly stories, like you can look at certain, Nicholas of Myra ends up being like conflated with other, Saint Nikolai, at the time, right? That, and some of the stories end up being sort of meshed together. And so that's acknowledged, that happens within tradition. But again, it's not as if these things are what the faith, sort of lives or dies on. But I will say this, when it comes to that sort of threshold that you're talking about plausibility, I have noticed that there's something that happens sometimes with folks where, I took a bunch of students, Protestant students, to a monastery once to teach an early Christianity class. And the idea was, we're going to be at a monastery, living in a monastery for a couple of weeks, and, experiencing the whole thing while reading early patristic texts, right? And they read the life of St. Anthony. And I remember thinking it was so humorous to listen to them sitting there, like, talking amongst themselves when they think I'm not listening, like snickering about, like, man, I mean, this is crazy, man. This is like comic book superhero stuff here, this St. Anthony. And the things that they're naming about the life of St. Anthony, for example, it's really just the sort of thing that it's like, it's no more implausible than anything that's in the Bible. But the difference is, you have this thing that says, like, well, if it's in the Bible, it's true, no matter how fantastical. But the second we step out of that, you're a modernist skeptic, aren't you? Mm-hmm. Like, there is this weird pocket within you that's where the Bible is allowed to say whatever it wants, and it's totally plausible. And the moment you step out of that, you're just David Hume. Like, what? Like, it's really sort of wild in that way. And I do think when it comes down to it, and philosophically, this is something I've talked about miracles in a few different contexts on my podcast. Just recently, I talked about it. But I think one of the things when it comes to miracles, I would say a couple of different things are there. The one is that sometimes we have a tendency to confuse our sort of our disposition toward something being plausible or not with whether it's rational. And so this is sort of thing that William James talks about, when he's talking about that certain things just strike certain people as plausible or implausible, right? And they confuse that with it being rational or irrational. But really, that's a pre-volitional, like, this is either it connects with you, it's viable, or it doesn't. And that's one thing. And then also, one of the things that Peter Berger, a sociologist, who's dealt with like epistemology stuff and specifically sociological epistemology, he's pointed out that a lot of our sort of the things that we find plausible or implausible are culturally conditioned, that largely because we are social animals, that what we find plausible is determined in many ways by what we see other people finding plausible. And so like where our boundary lines are oftentimes determined in those social ways. Now, somebody like Berger is not suggesting that means that there's nothing rational. He just says like, you just shouldn't confuse a rational judgment with this sort of dispositional, sort of predispositional, pre-volitional, pre-rational judgment. And I think you can see this in a variety of ways. Like you can see this with somebody like Joe Rogan, who on the one hand, he'll sit there and if you bring up God and intelligent design and things like that, and you start to talk about it, he'll be like, I don't know, man, God, like he's really sort of skeptical. But then if you're like, man, but humans are just too advanced, so we must have been intelligently designed by aliens. He's like, totally, like 100%. And it's like, well, why? Why, Joe? It's the same argument. Actually, one is more compelling because God actually contains an explanation for his existence within himself, whereas the aliens don't. But but it's the same argument. And the reason is because Joe has a materialist disposition. And so an organism designing you is more palatable to Joe than a spirit because he doesn't have a concept of a spirit, right? Because he's skeptical in that sort of way. But that's not actually a rational judgment. And that's just his sort of like materialist mechanical philosophy, post-enlightenment sort of disposition. And so I would just say that with a lot of people, when it comes to like judging hagiography or stories like that, there's a real need to just sort of like be suspicious of our own dispositions and recognize that a lot of times those sort of reflexive tendencies to respond to something as plausible or implausible isn't as rational as we take it to be, and actually be willing to sort of like put it in pause and put it in check and actually assess. Now, I don't say that in order to say that every hagiographic tradition is, true. It's just to say that like finding it implausible doesn't suffice to actually say that it didn't happen or that it's even irrational. So that's what I'd say there. Just one last thing, circling back to one of the things that I talked about with regard to the approach to tradition. I'd talked about, obviously just a second ago, I talked about the fact that like the church fathers come to the text already knowing what Christianity is. This is actually a really important feature of how they understand mystery in the first place. And this is something, again, I have a whole episode on misunderstanding mystery on my podcast where I talk about this. But the idea is that today, short version is just that today, so many people tend to use mystery like, I don't know. It's like, it's a way of just punting and being like, it's true, but I can't defend it or articulate it. So it's a mystery, right? Something like that. It becomes an intellectually lazy move. But that's not what mystery ever meant, like in the early Christian tradition. So when you look at like the way, and when you look at the way in which the term emerges, right, in somebody like, I think it's originally in Plato, where it's derived from the verb mean, which has to do with like to shut, which was related to mystery cults, where you'd be initiated shutting your eyes or shutting your mouth as part of the orientation, and then Plato develops this into the term for the mysterious one, which is somebody who's been initiated, which then becomes the basis for the talk of mysteries in people like Clement of Alexandria, where he's just talking about like the mysteries had to do with essentially, I mean, for Clement, it's being able to understand the cryptic stuff in the Old Testament because now the substance that casts the shadows is here. Right. So it's very much Pauline in that sense, where Paul's like, well, these Old Testament shadows are anticipating something. Christ is the something. Now that it's here, now that the sacraments are here, now that the whole story is told, now you can look back and be like, oh, I see all the Easter eggs. Oh, I see the shadows. Like, oh, it all makes sense now.
It's revelation and
That's
not
right.
Yeah,
That's right. And that's one of the reasons why Origen, how he interprets, like allegorically, how he interprets the transfiguration is that like you have Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, and then Christ's robes are the four gospels, and they glow and they illumine, the law and the prophets so that you can actually understand them now, whereas previously they were cryptic and dark and you couldn't understand them, things like that. That's primarily how they understood it, is that it's like you've been oriented, right? You are now a Gnostic, right? You are somebody not Gnostic, obviously, in a bad way. But like Clement likes that term. He's like, they so corrupted it. It was such a good term, right? But like, like you're somebody who's in the know, right? You're somebody who's been oriented, and now that you've been initiated, you actually do. You understand the shadows that were before because you've seen the substance. And I think methodologically, that's a really important thing, because that not only offers you a way of saying like, well, this is how we discern and look at and work our ways through all of this cryptic stuff in the Old Testament, but it's also what helps you sift when you're going through the stuff that is not actually canon, and you're looking at this, these parallel texts and things like that. It offers you some sort of rudder for navigating that as well. And so I mean, anyway, that's a lot, and it hopefully it's not too muddy, but
yeah, no, it definitely makes sense. That was in some ways some of the comments I put below that question was that like it does seem sometimes that biblical interpreters just draw the line differently in a different place than the skeptical scholar does, but they all seem to have some kind of incredulity over the supernatural in some ways. And so the skeptical scholar is just like, I don't believe in the virgin birth, I don't believe in the resurrection. All of those things are implausible to me. And sometimes the conservative or evangelical biblical scholar might just draw that line of incredulity in another place, and like you said, all of a sudden become a human.
Yeah. Well, and I think also this is there's sort of this weird tendency to talk like the secular scholar doesn't bring anything, like bringing any baggage to the text. Are you kidding me? There was an article I always wanted to write. Maybe you can write it instead, or you two can co-author it or something. But I wanted to write an article, the bigotry of biblical studies, and it was actually just all about the fact that when you look at the sort of origin of like the Tübingen school and that's sort of like the birth of modern biblical studies that drives so much of secular study, it's inherently like triumphalistic with regard to like Prussian and German thought, right? Where it's basically, I mean, it's embarrassing to should be embarrassing for the skeptic who likes David Hume to read his critique of miracles, because most of it is like, man, you can't trust these backwater hicks who, they're just living in huts. Like it's overtly just like they're not developed and sophisticated like us, so you can't rely they're just so dumb and superstitious. And that's really part and parcel of so much of German idealism that gave rise to that they had a philosophy of progress, the idea that it's a foregone conclusion that Moses was dumb in comparison with John. And so there's no way that Moses could have as sophisticated a view as John has. So whichever interpretation is the most dumb, the most tribal, the most unsophisticated, that's more likely Moses. And if you're going to say that it's like really sophisticated and it starts to approach something that looks anything like what we get later on, obviously that's false. And that really is born out of a certain triumphalistic view of history that has to do with a view of progress, and that really did, people like G.W.F. Hegel, F.W.J. Schelling, people like that, Lessing and others, they really did say like, look, it's just like, it's preferential. Whatever interpretation makes it more developmental, the better. And so if we say that there's not even, we don't even have the Tetragrammaton in the, in Genesis, and it's a later edition, and there's different editors and things like that. And the more Moses has a tribal deity, and it's not even henotheism and like whatever else, like the more we can make it like that, so it progresses over time and develops and changes and evolves, the better. And obviously they don't even mean continuity, right? They mean conflicting, genuine change in theology over time. And that is the lens that so many secular Bible scholars carry into it. So the idea that somehow there's like the secular, like neutral lens is obviously absurd. They bring their own tradition to it.
And just to reference back to one of our first episodes of Hebrew Bible Breakdown with Dr. Mark Gillette, he mentioned that was part of what he did, was walk through kind of the history of biblical studies and some of the presuppositions and things like that. And he talks about like, they were presuppositionally atheists, like, and just like none of this stuff 100%. Could happen. So they kind of completely sideline like belief as part of it. So that's kind of the operating system of biblical studies, kind of to this day.
100%. Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm wondering, because we got this really great question from Spencer, but I want to kind of try to bring us back around a little bit to get to Spencer's question, because we are seeing, I think, maybe playing out in what's this tension of storytelling and how it's, how do we tell good stories biblically? There is Spencer, I'll just put it up here. So, question for Dr. Jacobs. Is there a relationship between faith-based PG storytelling impulse and the deconstruction movement? Because we've deconstructed from so much of the basis of the tradition and the history of the faith, and going back to rediscover it, and now sanitizing these stories to be told in these contexts. Like, I would really, with Spencer, I would really love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think there probably is, to an extent. Yes. So here's one of the things that I would say on this point is that I do think there's a sense in which the depth of the person telling the story comes through in the story being told. Right. So one of the reasons why Tolkien feels so deep is because he's a linguist. And so he's somebody who understands language. Understands the relationship between language and culture, fairy stories, all this sort of stuff. And he obviously spends a lifetime just building a world such that you feel those layers, right? You'll step into a scene and you're like, I don't know. Yeah, I'm pretty sure everybody in the scene knows something about some history and some people and some battles and some stuff that happened here that I don't know what they're talking about. But clearly there are layers upon layers upon layers of soot built on, that this scene is standing upon. And you just feel that with Tolkien. His depth comes through, his sophistication comes through. Even with Lewis, where he doesn't build out his worlds as thoroughly as Tolkien does. He's not a world builder to the extent that Tolkien was. What people love about Lewis is that they sense the layers of his theology. And I think that's actually always one of the things that's so difficult about adapting Lewis, is that what people don't realize is they're sort of lost in his storytelling. And it's his narrative asides where he's really teaching you Neoplatonism or something like that you thought were part of the story. And it's really just Lewis sort of lulling you into a side lecture, about Aristotle or something like that. And then suddenly they realize if you just put it on screen, all of a sudden it's just animals talking and a lot of that depth goes away. And you're like, what happened? But I think the thing is, like, the depth of Lewis comes through in the story. His depth, his layers come through in the story. And again, same with Dostoevsky, same with a lot of these storytellers. And so I think the contrast, of course, is if the storyteller is superficial, right? If they are somebody who is shallow, the story that's told ends up coming across shallow as well. And I think that's something that's not oftentimes appreciated. And so something that I think that has happened over time, certainly in Protestant circles, has been this sort of this thinning and shallowing of the pool. So it's interesting to look. I mean, like, put aside just the storytelling itself. Just take an issue of like systematic theology, right? Like discussions about predestination or something like that. It's interesting that if you go back and you look at like the 16th, 17th century discussions of predestination, first of all, people who like go back and are sophisticated and read like older texts, they'll just read like Luther and Calvin. But the fact of the matter is Luther and Calvin are relatively superficial compared to like the other discussions that are happening in the 16th, 17th century. So once you start reading all these other sort of scholastics that follow after them, who are having to deal with the Roman Catholics and things like that, like Spurzus Fuchsius and Johannes Homoris and Maccovius and all these sorts of folks, you're like, wow, this is as deep and nuanced and sophisticated and careful as any like medieval scholastic discussion. And in fact, it's building on an entire medieval scholastic discussion about predestination and about like the order of decrees or instances of nature, if you're using like John Duns Scotus's language and all this sort of stuff. And you're like, wow, that's a really high level metaphysical discussion that's happening. And then what you see that start to thin out. And starts to happen actually in early America. If you compare like the early American discussions on these sorts of topics, the scholasticism is starting to disappear from the puritanical writings of early America. And that thinning starts to happen more and more in early America, to the point that people who become more sophisticated, like John Nevin, their contemporaries don't even understand what they're writing. So John Nevin, for example, is somebody who rediscovered, the Mercersburg school that did like the NPNF and the ANF. Nevin was part of that school. And so he was deep into patristics, rediscovers the Eastern Fathers, doing a lot of writings on that. and the Mercersburg Review and all this sort of stuff, very sophisticated stuff. And then somebody like Charles Hodge reads them and he doesn't even recognize the stuff. He's like, I don't know. He must be some German idealist, Hegelian or something like that. He doesn't even have a category for understanding what's happening anymore and that sort of thing. And so soon what happens is you get these thin down, discussions until you just have like, now the version is like, well, are you a Calvinist or are you an Arminian? And then that becomes just like this simple dichotomy, and all the nuances about different types of necessity or causality or things like that starts to fall away. And you get this more and more sort of like superficial version of that. And I think you even see that in a lot of the discussions, like about what differentiates Protestantism from Catholicism, like the early disputes about justification by grace through faith alone and things like that. They were disputes having to do with merits and demerits and transferred merits and, prevenient grace and all this sort of stuff. And now it's sort of like been thinned down to the point that it's like, well, Catholics think you earn your salvation by good works, and Protestants think Jesus just loves you, right? Like, or something like that. You get this very thinned down version of it. And so I think the thing is, what's happened is the more the transmission of Protestantism has like thinned out, and the theology has become more and more superficial. And with that, it's untethered from any sort of liturgical tradition. So it's not like it's sitting on top of something that has layers. Like, at least if you met a superficial Catholic, the fact that they're still tethered to the Catholic Church means that there's some sort of layers underneath their superficiality, right? But it's like, okay, well, we just started our own house church and we're not part of a denomination, and so now we're theologically superficial and we're not standing on anything. I think it gets thinner and thinner, and part of the thing that happens is that over time, then the stories they start telling are thinner and thinner and more superficial. And so I think the PG is sort of the very sort of saccharine and superficial and thin, and what feels borderline juvenile sometimes about a lot of these stories is the fact that the storyteller is themselves somebody who's not terribly sophisticated, and they're part of a tradition that has been so diluted that it's also not terribly sophisticated. And I think that's the sort of thing that comes through. You contrast that with Mel Gibson. Like, Mel Gibson's not a theologian, but he's deeply tapped into his own Catholic tradition. And so in that sense, those layers that he stands upon still come through in that. So, I mean, I guess that's my inkling in terms of what the sort of connection might be, that it's part of the evolution of the ways in which the theology and the worldview and things like that have sort of it's continued to dismantle itself and deconstruct itself until the point that it really is not really standing on much. So the stories to tell reflect that fact. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that definitely makes sense, because then, like I said, when talking to some of my youth, when they're wrestling through a lot of these really big questions, like that's how I got into a lot of the patristic material. I had a really good seminary education where we read a lot of the primary text material. So I knew where to go back to, but like, I felt like the answers that were given to me by my tradition were really thin for some of the questions that they were asking, like theology of the body, or, why they're asking the big questions, like the meaning of life, why we're here, anthropology, all of those good things. But you actually have to wrestle through like big theological topics in order to get there. And just this kind of like flattened out how you get saved doesn't really do much to equip you as a pastor to. Yeah. Well, and I think in many ways, certain questions that you start to ask, there's no way of actually dealing with them. There's sort of like this myth of like Christianity being metaphysically neutral. And I did a couple of lectures on that I published on my Substack, just about, I call it a myth because it's so clear that in the early Christian discussions, all of the ecumenical councils, all the discussions about Trinity and Christology are wildly philosophical. And they have very clear philosophical commitments that are in the Nicene Creed. Like there is no way to read those and say that it's philosophically neutral. Like, this is not like, oh, we have these commitments and then whatever philosophy you want. But also, I think one of the things that, certain topics that you yourself, Courtney, are interested in, right? You brought up, I know that you're interested in the topic of theophany. And so it's like, okay, you're going to ask the question, like, are the theophanies God or are they not God? Well, what you'll find very quick, as you found very quick, is the moment you start digging into those questions, you start to discover that there are all of these metaphysical questions about the transcendence of God, about divine mutability, about, shifting accidental properties, about the essence and the energies and things like that. And there really is no like, well, let's dodge the metaphysics time, right?
Yeah.
Let's dodge the metaphysics of it and just start, just talk about what the biblical text says, because it does actually require that to really wrestle with the biblical text and those sorts of questions inevitably just plunges you into these metaphysical waters. You have to deal with them. There's no getting around it. I saw this once. I remember there was a lecture given by someone. I'm blanking on who it was, but it was sent my way. Somebody was asking, was it Peter Lightford? Anyway, they were espousing like, well, we should get rid of like the Chalcedonian Christology, and what we should replace it with is, just the Johannine Christology. And they were basically just sort of like arguing that this sort of biblical theology that's driven by the Johannine text. And the natural question is like, okay, well, how should we read this Johannine theology? Is he like one person, or is he two? Is he divine and human? Is he like, and you start to immediately, what starts to emerge if you start to ask questions of the biblical text is you start to ask all the philosophical questions that you have, that Chalcedon and the rest of the ecumenical councils are asking. So this sort of like fantasy that somehow you can just like, well, just stick with the biblical language and like trust that that's answering the questions sufficiently without asking any follow-up questions that would take us into philosophical territory. It doesn't work. It doesn't happen. It's not possible. Everybody does metaphysics. It's just a question of, do you do it well or do you do it poorly? Do you do it knowingly or do you do it where you're fumbling around in the dark because you don't know that you're, engaged in it? But there's no avoiding it. You can't just like not do it.
And like you were saying earlier, it's like just because we've kind of been inheritors of a certain type of metaphysics, then whenever we hear a certain interpretation or a certain like view, it just automatically sounds implausible, even if we haven't thought about our philosophy or thought about our metaphysics, because like we're standing on the heritage of those ideas. So if the question of like, is the angel of the Lord Jesus, which we've talked about on this channel before, I think that I'm just really interested in theophanies and the Trinity in the Old Testament, all those good things. You guys, I got accepted to PhD program this past week, so I will be starting the program in August, which will be pretty fun. But some people immediately, and biblical scholars, Christians in the Christian tradition, this is not just a modern problem. This is a problem that goes way back. But it's like the time traveling Jesus. Like, how did Jesus do that? If he became incarnate at this one moment, how does he time travel? And like, so that's kind of how they throw it at you, as if it's like incredible. Like, it's not credible. It's an implausible view. But that's just like you were saying, kind of a pre-rational reaction to it, even if they haven't thought about metaphysically what they're kind of asserting there. Yeah.
100%. And I think you see this in all sorts of discussions. I don't think a lot of people appreciate how often metaphysical issues come up, like in polemics, like the Reform polemics against the Lutherans about real presence and things like that. So many of those had to do with, like, at least one of the standard polemics had to do with the idea that a body can't be in more than one location at once, right? And that was just sort of forwarded as, a premise. Of course, Francis Pieper is just like, well, the difference between the Lutherans and the Reformed is we believe the Bible and they don't, right? But anyway, but like those are always things that, inevitably it always comes up in
that put down is as old as time. We believe the Bible and you don't.
And I'm laughing really hard because I grew up in the Restoration Movement tradition, Alexander and Thomas Campbell and Barton Stone, and I'm a survivor of that, right? And grew up with this understanding that hermeneutics, because they developed their hermeneutical model from the teachings of Francis Bacon and his scientific method. And so talk about a carved up Thanksgiving turkey.
Oh, yeah.
And so when I went and entered seminary, and I got confronted with with Dr. Ray Lubeck and forcing me to get out of that dynamic, that was a tough transition to make. So, like understanding the narrative and the theme and why. So like, that's why we spend so much time on narrative on my channel and here on Hebrew Bible Breakdown, because that, I think, helps us transcend some of those communications about some of the metaphysics and things like that. So I think it's helpful.
And if you don't know, Ray Lubeck was
Right.
Tim Mackey's mentor.
Yeah.
So their kind of method of interpreting narrative, scripture, literary approach to the Bible.
Right.
That's what she's talking about. That kind of broke her out of the well, it doesn't say this.
Yeah, well, and that entire sort of Francis Bacon like scientific method. I mean, it's an outgrowth of the Enlightenment. It's an outgrowth specifically of the empiricist school. People like John Locke, who were like, look, the biblical text is the one thing that's inspired. So as we're trying to we can't trust the other stuff, but we can trust this. And so if we can dissect it in a way where we're very clear on what the data is, then at least we have, building blocks to put into our sort of, our rational system here. And so that was very much just part of an Enlightenment project that had a really idiosyncratic approach to the biblical text. It made sense to a lot of people who are born out of a Protestant, Western, modernist framework, right? It made perfect sense to the rest of us, but it's wildly idiosyncratic in terms of I mean, it does not fit at all the ways in which ancient people handled these texts.
I don't even think it fits at all in terms of how science itself conceives of its own knowledge making process now. My husband, he's a scientist and he's a cancer pathologist, and he's like, there is no way to teach someone by a book how to identify that this is a cancer cell. The only way to do it is to entrench yourself in an epistemic community of people who've been trained how to see it and how to identify it, and they show you how to see it and identify it. And you just look at slides over and over and over again. And to me, those slides look like nothing because I'm not trained to notice the difference. But to him, they look like something. But you can't write it down in a book because you actually have to be looking at it at the same time that you're engaging in it. It's just somebody who's trained ahead of you who points at the thing and says, that's a cancer cell, that's not a cancer cell, you look here, you don't look there, and all those kinds of things. So they're submitting to a traditioned community that is the holder of knowledge, and all of his interpretation, all science data is interpretation, and it depends on the training of the interpreter as to the effectiveness of the experiments and the experimental relevance that comes out of that. So,
I think this goes to an area of epistemology that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but it's demonstrably true, which is that our ability to see certain things changes as we change. And so like anybody who's learned to play an instrument, for example, knows what it's like to be like, oh, I love this band and this song, and it's so brilliant, and I can't wait until, I get good enough at guitar in order to, play this song, right? To learn this song and play it. And then as you get better at your instrument, suddenly you start to see, oh, that band that I thought was so great, they're actually pretty mediocre. And this other band that I didn't think was great, I'm realizing is really great and brilliant. And all of a sudden your lenses start to shift, because as you're growing, as you're actually developing, right? We were using Aristotelian terms, that potential is moving into actuality in terms of that actual, that art within you. You're actually able to see reciprocally, things more clearly. And obviously this is part of virtue epistemology as well. The idea that the more virtuous I become, the clearer I am epistemologically. I'm in a better position in order to discern what's actually going on there. And this is certainly something that's true in terms of and I think that's the sort of thing that you're seeing there, what your husband's talking about in terms of discerning and being immersed in that, and the rehearsal of that, and being part of an epistemic community. That's certainly something that's there in the Eastern Church Fathers, where they're like, I don't even think the heretics are really in a position to talk about the things that they're talking about. And that's partially in commentary on virtue, right? The importance of this is one of the reasons why there was such heavy reliance upon saints and ascetics and things like that, who had, developed and grown spiritually to the point that it was presumed they had a certain clarity, but also had to do with submission to the community and being within the hospital, and these sorts of things. And that's the area that I think makes us really uncomfortable, because what we really want, especially as children of Western modernity, we really want just sort of my objective. I can sit down, I can analyze it. Give me the methodology where I can just sort of like, I can sentence diagram it. I can look it up in my lexicon, and it doesn't matter what my life is like, what my condition is like, what I'm like. I can discern it because it's just data, right? That's just there objectively and things like that. And the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of areas in human experience, probably most areas of human experience, where it's not quite that simple, and that, you know, the condition of the individual, the ontology of the individual plays into the ability of the individual to see clearly. And that's certainly something that at least the church fathers thought was definitely true when it comes to theology itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you see, just to draw it back to the Hebrew Bible, the same kind of thing happening in the Hebrew Bible is like, how do you know that Deuteronomy is right? Well, you go and you ask your mom or your dad, and they tell you, you know, or you go and ask the elders of your community, and they tell you, and then you participate in these like ritual liturgical actions because, you know, the Lord brought you up out of Egypt, so this is why you do Passover every year, even if you were born in the land. He brought you up out of Egypt, so you're participating in this community that is self-interpreting scripture as they're writing scripture, but then also they're like living and inhabiting it in particular ritual actions, you know, just like my husband's doing a scientific experiment. A scientific experiment is a repeated ritual action. All right, so I think we've got a couple questions. I don't know how long your time was, but in the starred questions,
and we got a couple more.
Yeah, we've got a couple questions in our starred from our audience.
Okay.
So
which one?
Amber,
which one do we want to do? Okay, what do you want to do? Do we have okay? Let's set somebody that's not Spencer, because Spencer had a few.
Yeah,
let's go to John's question here. What do you think about the new documentary film trailer for American Orthodox? The film will be released soon, but the trailer is on YouTube.
Oh, I can't speak to this one because I don't know. The trailer for American Orthodox. Do we know anything about like who did it or anything like that? I can't speak to the trailer because I haven't seen it, or even the project.
I don't know anything about it.
He did mention, John, if you're still here, that there was like some other movie, some other Orthodox theme movie that kind of came before this, and it's the same creators.
Okay, I'm wondering. I mean, this isn't from the maker of New Men, is it?
No, I don't think so. It's like, I feel like it was like S of something, like a word starting with S and something of something. I'm like not going to be able to find it now because I didn't have the controls to star or save things.
Yeah, unfortunately, I without watching it, I don't have much to say about it. I'd be curious to know.
Sacred Alaska producer worked on American Orthodox.
Sacred Alaska. See, I was like,
Sacred Alaska producer worked on the American Orthodox. I don't know. This is I don't know this group. I mean, maybe I do. Maybe there's somebody out there who's like, "What do you mean you don't know me? We just had coffee last week." And I'm like, oh, that's your company, right? Like maybe that's there's something like that. But yeah, I don't know anything about this project.
All right. Sorry. And then Deborah's question too.
Okay. What do you see happening in the future as far as Hollywood movies go about God with the new generation?
Oh, this is a good question. It's a good question.
Deborah. What's that? Say congratulations, Deborah. You got a good question.
Congratulations, Deborah. You have a good question. Well, it's a good question because it goes into this territory that I really don't know. I mean, I can speak a bit about what I see happening behind the scenes in the Hollywood conversation. There's a really big question about what's going to pan out. So I do know that there's a group with Universal that has been tasked with, sort of doing faith stuff, because there's a lot of different places that are like, okay, there's money to be made with faith. That space is hot right now. And I know that the group with Universal is looking to be unconventional, right? They're looking to sort of redefine how you think about faith stuff. And yet at the same time, there's still some of those, at least in my conversations, there's still some of those sensitivities, right? There's a desire for the high end, authentic storytelling. There's a desire, for, I don't think there's an interest in sort of agenda-driven propagandistic stuff, but there's still some of those natural sensitivities that say, I don't know if American Christians can handle this, that, or the other. So I've seen that there. I've been approached before by somebody who was tasked with putting together money for a foundation to do, faith films, and I gave them my pitch for what I think they should do, which is more in the vein of like the Mel Gibson type thing. But at the end of the day, they were like, well, I think we're going to do a safe bet and we'll go with like a family friendly Christmas movie, and it was like, okay, all right. I'm sure that'll move the needle, and, and then obviously there are places that are continuing to get financing and do well, but they definitely represent that sort of base hit type thing where it's like a safe, higher end quality, working with major studios, but they're definitely representative of that sort of very sort of safe middle of the road type project. What's interesting is that there are so many very good writers, creators, directors who are not of that mind, who are of the mind of like, let's do something that's really unconventional. Let's do the sort of more Mel Gibson spirit type project. But the challenge that they always run into is always the studios, that the studios are like, I don't know that that's a thing. But the funny thing is, like, talk to any Christian in the country and all of it. I mean, just like all of us would have known that Aronofsky's Noah would have bombed. All of us also can tell you, like, yeah, it would be huge if you actually just sort of like ripped off the shackles and said, go ahead and do the R-rated Bible the way it should be and tell it as a good story, do it Mel Gibson. Like it'd be the biggest franchise in the world, right? Like ever. We all know it, but Hollywood, which holds the purse strings, is like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I think we'll keep on doing base hits. So I think what's interesting is right now there's a moment right now when Hollywood is open, we're like, hey, we're interested in faith stuff. And there are a lot of filmmakers out there clamoring to step into that space. There's a lot of filmmakers out there trying to build their own film funds right now because they're like, the only way to force Hollywood to make our projects is to bring the money to the table. And that's true. But it's hard to raise that money. And there's sort of like this tendency that like filmmakers will go and raise enough money for one small project. And then like you've got all these little projects that have a little bit of funding. And what nobody ever does is just like put them together into one big pot where you could like finance big projects and do that. So I know that there are different people I know of at least 3 different film funds that are trying to be built up right now for that purpose. Whether they'll succeed, I don't know. Like I said, I know a lot of studios that are interested in the films in the faith space, and they're talking to the right sort of filmmakers who are the sort of folks who could, really sort of change the way this is done. But we all run into the same thing with Hollywood, where they're like, I don't know if that's what American Christians want. So I could see what I see right now is I see that there's sort of 2 ways this could go. We're in a moment right now where hypothetically somebody in Hollywood says yes and opens the door and takes a gamble, and you finally get something that's kind of like the Passion, in that spirit. I'm not saying it's the Passion, right? But it's in that spirit, and it really blows up, and all of a sudden Hollywood's like, whoa, let's do more of that, because that's all Hollywood needs, right? Like Hollywood doesn't want to take any risks, but all of a sudden, like somebody takes a risk and the movie blows up. Everybody in town's like, do you have something like that? So you need somebody to actually take that risk, and that's tough, but it could happen, and that would really change things. The alternative is Hollywood continues to just say pass, 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 and you get very safe, middle of the road, PG-13 light sort of stuff, and it has a certain amount of success, and then it peters out, and you never really feed where I think the real hunger is, right? Like I actually think all that we started talking about the nuns, the religiously unaffiliated folks, those folks are interested in discussions like the Nephilim. Those folks are interested in discussions about a re-enchanted world. Those folks are interested in like pre-flood civilization. Those folks are interested in these stories. And so that's where when I say like you would have a much larger audience, I'm not talking about like, oh, you could have the evangelicals and the Catholics show up. Like I'm talking about like everybody would be interested in this.
The 96% of people who think ghosts are real. Yeah.
That's right. Exactly right. And so I think the thing is like, if somebody in Hollywood finally gives the right person or set of persons a chance, or if, you know, some of these film fund efforts succeed and Hollywood is forced to give a chance, that could change things. If not, I suspect they'll just sort of strangle the current momentum, and it'll eventually, you know, gasp and die out, and we'll see. So I know which one I hope for, and I know which one I'm trying for. If there's any billionaires listening who are like, yeah, let's do that film fund.
Yeah, I know we get a lot of questions around here and on my channel about ancient Near East, because people really want to know, how does this fit in the context of the Hebrew Bible? How does that all work?
Yeah.
So we get that a lot. Okay, so we had another question we wanted to put up here, because Courtney and I both also want to know the answer to this one as well.
Oh.
So what is your take on the possibility of Greta Gerwig's Narnia series having Meryl Streep voice Aslan? Is that a taxidermy or not?
Hold on. I just need to compose myself.
Some people thought it was April Fool's when it came out, because it was April 1st.
Right.
So
Was
it?
Like,
it
yeah,
was on
it
April 1st.
Yep.
They're like, oh, this is a joke, and everybody's freaking out over a joke. Like, why are you
okay,
freaking
so
out
just in general, I'll just say, the second I heard that they were giving episodes to Greta Gerwig, I was just like, this is a disaster. Greta is a fine filmmaker, but I don't get the impression that she sets aside her views when she makes a film, right? Like, she is, so she's technically proficient, but I do think of her as an activist. I do think her views come through. I don't think of her as the sort of person who would ever do what Peter Jackson did, which said, well, like, what I think about stuff doesn't matter. I'm here to be a steward of this precious IP that belongs to J.R.R. Tolkien. And so it doesn't matter what I think. It only matters what Tolkien thinks. And I'm here to be, you know, a caretaker of ushering this forth. I don't get that impression from Greta. And the problem is that Greta's views are as night and day when it comes to C.S. Lewis. You could not pick somebody who is, you know, who is more adverse to the worldview of C.S. Lewis than her. And so the idea of handing his property over to her is, I think it's immoral. I think it's actually immoral. And so it's tragic. I don't think I could ever stomach it. Of course, if I saw this same announcement, and I was doing my own diligence to see if I could see, is this real, or is this like a terrible, terrible nightmare, or is this a terrible joke? And I never really got a clear answer. I mean, the stuff that I saw obviously was talking about, like, Aslan is, of course, we're going to make Aslan a woman. Of course, we're also, Aslan's like just a steward or a guide or a mentor to Narnia or something like that. There was definitely, in terms of what was announced that I saw, it was very much like, okay, Aslan's no longer Christ, right? Like, very clearly, he is no longer Christ. And at that point, you have most certainly gutted the entire, I don't care what happens after that, right? Like, you have completely gutted, desecrated Lewis's corpse is what you've done there. And so, yes, I fully expect that this version of Narnia will be Hollywood taxidermy on a grand scale, a very expensive grand scale of desecrating the corpse of Lewis. I would love to be wrong, but I don't think I am.
Probably not. All right.
Sad and unfortunate, because it's beloved.
Yeah. Right. We've got another question here. What are your thoughts on Graham Hancock's work, especially as a bridge to the counter narrative of the Bible?
I don't really know that I have anything.
Like the Ancient Aliens guy.
Yeah, I I mean, as a bridge, I don't know that I'd call it a bridge. I mean, here's the thing. Okay, let's talk aliens. Aliens. Like,
well, actually, when Graham Hancock was like, oh, there's all these stories, I think his conclusion is like that it's like a comet that came and destroyed the earth or something, and that's how you get this global flood.
Mhm.
And so, but you get these the same mythological stories around the world.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
this is a lot of like, if I'm remembering correctly, if I'm thinking of the right person, this is a lot of like basically like alternative history type
Mhm.
stuff, right? Okay, so not an expert by any stretch, but here's my impression of what's going on. So I think in terms of a lot of the religiously unaffiliated folks who are sort of searching for some sort of sense of meaning, there is a tendency to desire with that a re-enchanted world. And obviously I've lectured about this, the fact that, you know, the majority of the unaffiliated are not atheists. The majority of the unaffiliated are, you know, they believe in God or a higher power. They believe the world is spiritual. They believe they're spiritual. And so there's clearly this desire for some sort of like, and that there's also an interest in the paranormal and the occult and things like that. And so I think there's clearly that sort of drive looking for a remythologized world. And I think that same drive is part of what drives so many of them to look into alternative histories, because they're building their own mythology, right? And that mythology, it could be aliens, it could be some form of, you know, yeah, Anunnaki, right, sort of thing. It could be like whatever it is, you know, in terms of the alternative histories. But I think that's the sense that the story is different than what they've been told, the sense that the story, maybe there are lost civilizations, lost technologies, maybe there are other intelligences, maybe there are all these sorts of things. I think that is basically the reason that's become so popular and so engaging for people, is because it opens the world up from this cold static clockwork that they feel like they're into something that is mysterious and unknown to them. Maybe there are layers of meaning here that I didn't know about. And so I think that's driving them forward. And I think that is conducive. I don't know that any of the particular narratives are conducive, but I think it's conducive in the sense that at least the sort of going down that road opens them up. We talked about these sort of presuppositions that are there, right? It opens them up to the idea that the world is very different than the story they've been told, a very material, you know, very dead, very clockwork, very boring, you know, story that they've been handed. The idea that the story actually becomes more elaborate, more ancient, more unconventional, I think it opens up those boundary lines. Now, I think the challenge with it is exactly what I talked about with Rogan, is that so often there is a clinging to the sort of underlying presupposition that spirits are, you know, implausible, but, you know, an organism is plausible. And so that's why there would always be a preferential thing toward like aliens, right? Like, and over something like God. So I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, I think the answer is it's a mixed bag. That on the one hand, I think it's a very good thing that people are challenging conventional narratives, that they're challenging their own presuppositions, that they're being opened up to alternative stories that are a little more wild and crazy than what they might have always presumed about the world, and that's opening them up to things where they're like, well, maybe it's this thing in the Hebrew Bible that would have sounded crazy to me, like now maybe it's not so crazy. I think all of that's good. But I still think that there's a tendency in that towards scientism, where it's like, what I really want at the end of the day is to be told that there's some other advanced race that did this stuff and not a god, not spirits. And oftentimes it's also paired with the amoral. And so I think this is another thing about it. With so many of the religiously unaffiliated, there's a tendency to move away from organized religion toward the occult. And with that, there is just sort of this vague spirituality. I feel myself to be spiritual. The world is spiritual. I'm open to the spiritual things. But there's no recognition of the idea that maybe that should dictate how I live. And at the end of the day, what I'm kind of looking for is this thrill, right? Some sort of thrill that I get from the encounter with the paranormal, a thrill from unearthing a new cryptic mystery. And that impulse, I think, is a little more problematic as well, because at the end of the day, it's not a search for meaning as much as it's a form of hedonism, right? It's a form of occultist hedonism. And so, like I said, I think it's a really mixed bag, in the sense that there are certain things that are good about it, but the road that it's on has a lot of problems with it as well. So,
all right.
And I also think if just from my experience when coming into contact with people who like are on that path, like to have a minister who also just has this grounding in supernatural for real without thinking, kind of trying to explain the biblical supernatural away, is to then direct them on a path that would lead to an embodied Christian community is also kind of hard
Yeah.
because of kind of how anti-supernatural a lot of our church
Yeah.
methods are.
Yeah. A lot of churches are very deistic, and they don't really have a concept. And when they do have a concept of the supernatural, it oftentimes tends to be, again, a sort of clockwork sort of notion where there's just the material world and it's just something that just kind of invades sometimes. And it's not really fully understood. So yeah, I think you're right.
And I think we've got one last question from Deborah on The Chosen. She's asked it several times, and so we haven't gotten to it yet. So, what are your thoughts on the series The Chosen? It's the other big religious series out there.
Okay. So, what do I think about the series The Chosen? Full disclosure, I have not watched it. Okay, and I've actually intentionally not watched it. Okay, now, in case anybody out there is like, "What? I love it!" Like nothing I'm about to say. If you love it, that's fine. I'm not looking to to disparage anyone who really loves it. I met a guy who I felt pretty bad because he was asking my honest thoughts on it, and I told him what I thought, and he was basically told me how like The Chosen is the reason he rediscovered Christianity, and eventually became Orthodox, ironically. But I don't know, it's like, well, look, man, that's great. Like it's great that it's there for you. And he told me everything he liked about it, and that's great. And I do know a lot of people who really do like it. I mean, my daughter, who's glory to God, is devoutly Orthodox. She really enjoyed it, and she told me the things that she enjoyed about it. One of my godsons, James Joyner, who teaches philosophy at Northern Arizona University, he told me, again, like mixed bag, but told me a lot of things that he thought were quite good about it. And so I've heard good things about it. Challenge I have with it is that in general, I don't trust Hollywood to get Christology right. And I also don't trust Protestants to get Christology right.
Real spicy.
What's that?
Real spicy take.
Yeah. Sorry, I just don't. So Christology is one of the most nuanced philosophical topics that you could pick in terms of, the history of Christianity. This is the topic where all of the talk about the distinction between, a general nature and a subject emerge, where the difference between common properties in the generic sense, like will, versus the subject who has that will, the convergence of two natures in a way that doesn't mingle or get confused but is merged in one person, the difference between like first order potentiality and second order potentiality, and what means that Christ grows in wisdom, the Nestorian version of that, where it would be heretical, versus the non-Nestorian version of that, which wouldn't be heretical. This is some of the most finely nuanced metaphysical material you could get into in terms of the history of Christianity. Most people don't understand it, and I just say in general. And that includes a great many PhDs I've met who don't understand it. And so like, I'm deeply concerned about when it comes to that sort of thing, the challenge that I find with that is that when you go into something like storytelling, like The Chosen, you are going to be doing Christology. How you tell that story, how you portray Christ, it's going to be an exercise in Christology. You don't have to say the words, like hupostasis or sia or anything like that. You don't have to talk about like, the nomic will or something like that directly. You don't have to go into any of that technical stuff to be doing Christology. So for example, like contrast this with 40 Days in the Desert. I didn't have to watch 40 Days in the Desert to know just from the trailer, it's heretical. It's completely Nestorian, right? Like, okay, this is bad. And so the thing is like, my concern, there's in general, there's a concern that I have about, it's one thing to look at a story that's being told and respect it from a certain perspective. I don't have respect for heresy. Okay. So I don't want to watch 40 Days in the Desert because I know it's already heretical. It's one thing to read Arius because I have to read Arius in order to engage in theological, discussions. I don't read Arius for my personal benefit, right? Like I don't read Arius as an exercise and growth and devotion. I don't. And so like I don't want to subject myself to 2 hours of blasphemy by watching 40 Days in the Desert. Now, am I saying that The Chosen is heretical? I don't know. I didn't watch it, but I just anticipate based on my experience with most Protestants, including Protestant professors, that their understanding of Christology is so thin that they are more likely to not get it wrong. And so I really don't want to sort of delve into those waters. That's one reason. The other reason is candidly, I don't want to see some actor's face when I think about Jesus. Like, so as much as I enjoyed the Passion of the Christ, it really bothers me that when I think about certain moments in the Bible, Caviezel's face comes into my head. I don't want his face in my head. And so like, those are two reasons why I've been very resistant to The Chosen. It's one of the reasons why I think there was something really brilliant about the original Ben-Hur and the idea that Jesus shows up, but you never saw his face. Right. Like, I think there's something brilliant about that. And so I've thought about this. I've thought about projects that I have that involve Christology, and I'm very intentional in at least my conception of those projects about actually not showing Jesus's face or not inserting a certain actor, into people's heads when it comes to that. And so, so I'll just say that, like, it doesn't bother the things that I've heard about The Chosen. I've heard that it's generally well made. I've heard that, it's it moves into territory that, obviously is storytelling that's fleshing out relationships between disciples and things like that, may well be done just fine. And I think it's, and I think it's possible that it really sort of is engaging this way. I think it is interesting to ask certain questions about the psychology of certain disciples. There's a tendency in a lot of these things, like with the other storytelling aspects that we've talked about, a tendency to just accept, like, Peter does this and then does this and does that, and to not really ask the questions about, like, what is Peter really like? What's motivating him in these sorts of moments? And I think those are interesting things to do. I think it's interesting to spend time thinking about Judas and, like, what is really going on with a character like Judas, because it's very easy to just treat Judas like he's just a villain, right? Like, obviously he's like the picture of a traitor, but he's also a traitor who gives back the silver and hangs himself. That's not a simple character, right? Like, that's a conflicted, complex character. And so I think it's interesting to engage in those sorts of questions and try to understand those characters. Again, understanding that we're limited in our understanding. And, this goes to some of the stuff we talked about the difference between, like, canon and just sort of like those sort of speculative endeavors. But I'm not opposed to that aspect of The Chosen at all. It's really a personal choice that says, like, I have a suspicion that this is going to wander into tacitly or explicitly, blasphemous Christology that I'm not interested in, and I don't want an actor's face in my head when I think about Jesus. Sorry. For anybody out there who loves it and was like, I was hoping you were going to sing its praises. Sorry, that's
Mm-hmm.
that's
I haven't watched it either, and I get asked about it all the time. But yeah, just the nature of, like, my job where I teach biblical Greek and Hebrew online. People are just like, "What do you think about this Bible story?" And you're a Bible nerd, you've got to like this Bible story nerd TV
love
show.
it.
Yeah. So, but I also haven't watched it, and more for, like, pragmatic reasons. Initially, it was just like, oh, I'm, like, too busy, don't have time to catch up on this
Well,
thing.
that's true too.
Yeah. So, but also for some of the reasons you stated, and even, like, Jonathan Rumi now is like voice the Lord's Prayer on, like, the Hallow app. So, you can have the words of Jesus. You can meditate on the words of Jesus portrayed by the guy who says Jesus-y things on TV.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
I did watch the first 3 seasons. I would agree with Troy here. It's well-written storytelling, but their Christology is all over the place.
Okay. Yeah.
Definitely, for sure. Yeah.
It was definitely a red flag when I heard they weren't going to include the transfiguration because what is that? It doesn't have anything to do with their story. And I'm just thinking, whatever story you're telling, if the transfiguration doesn't fit, you might want to rethink how you're telling that story.
I'm not gonna lie, it gets short shrift in a lot of evangelical Bible commentaries on the Gospels too. So
Yeah, I don't think they know what to do with it, to be honest. But yeah,
I ran into that one time whenever I was teaching through the Gospels to the youth, and it was like, oh, what am I supposed to do with this story? And you're just like, God, darn it up empty all over the place. Well, we really thank you for your time and hanging out with us and answering all of our audience questions. I know they really enjoyed this. I know lots of them are fans of yours and have watched your content elsewhere as well. So they are kind of excited to have been able to ask the questions that they've been wanting to ask of a synthesis of your episodes. And I think we kind of got that, based on, the episodes that you dropped plus I dropped, or the articles that you dropped plus I dropped. We kind of skimmed a lot of your work there. So it's nice to have a synthesis of your thought on this one issue, which we're all kind of concerned about. It's like, what do we do with that?
Well, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Yeah, I know. It was fun. I mean, I'd love to be able to nerd out and do this again someday. Who knows if it could happen.
Just invite me back. Yeah.
Invite you back. Right. Awesome. Well, you guys, we're thankful that we had a good live audience, lots of interactive questions and comments. It was fun watching to see how you interacted with our thoughts today. But until we see you next time, we're just the Hebrew Bible Breakdown, trying to connect you to the scriptures one hyperlink at a time.
Nice.
All right.